Since 1947, it has been the policy of every Canadian government to support a two-state solution for lasting peace in the Middle East. This position envisioned the creation of a sovereign, democratic, and viable state of Palestine, building its future in peace and security alongside the State of Israel. It's an honor to be here. It's a tragedy that we must gather together. And it's a tragedy that we're all committed to reverse. You know, Mr. President, when I joined you a few weeks ago on Independence Day in Sophia Square, I emphasized that your struggle is our struggle. Your cause of freedom, democracy, sovereignty, and the human rights and dignity of every person, particularly children, is our cause, the cause of the 42 nations and more organizations gathered here today.
At the heart of Canada's rise was a speech that nobody expected. When Mark Carney, a Canadian leader with a reputation for calm diplomacy, took the stage at the United Nations, most assumed he'd deliver another careful statement. Instead, what followed was a verbal thunderbolt. Carney didn't mince words. He pointed directly at Vladimir Putin, blaming him for the horrors unleashed in Ukraine. He described a nightmare reality: thousands of children abducted, classrooms invaded, orphans snatched away and forced into Russian orphanages. And he didn't stop there. He detailed how these children were being indoctrinated, given Russian citizenship, and subjected to military-style training. The language was raw, emotional, and unflinching. Carney called it for what it was: a campaign of cruelty against the most vulnerable. For many in the audience, this wasn't the Canada they thought they knew. It wasn't the gentle peacekeeper of old. This was Canada stepping up as a defender of human rights on the world stage. And what came next only cemented that image. To drive home his message, Carney turned to the story of a boy named Ilya. Just 9 years old when his world collapsed, Ilya lived through one of the darkest chapters of the war. During a Russian attack on his city, Ilya saw his home destroyed and his mother killed right before his eyes. Injured and alone, he was taken by Russian soldiers into occupied territory. What followed was nothing short of horrifying. Doctors operated on him without anesthesia. Officials told him to abandon the phrase, "Glory to Ukraine," and instead repeat, "Glory to Ukraine" as part of Russia. For weeks, nobody in his family even knew if he was alive. His grandmother eventually found him, only by recognizing him in a Russian propaganda video. Through sheer determination, she managed to bring him back home. But the scars remained. Ilya lost his mother, his childhood, and his innocence. Carney made it clear, Ilya's story was not unique. Thousands of Ukrainian children faced similar fates, and Canada wasn't going to stand by. The audience was stunned. The world was watching, and Canada's message was clear. We will not be silent. That speech wasn't just emotional, it was backed by action. Canada stepped forward to co-chair the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children. This coalition, made up of 42 nations, had one goal: bring the stolen children home. But Canada wasn't just offering moral support, it was investing millions into technology, including artificial intelligence, to help track down and identify the missing. By combining humanitarian concern with technological innovation, Canada positioned itself as a global leader in both compassion and strategy. And while Canada pushed for the children's return, it was also tightening the screws on Russia's war machine. For years, sanctions had been viewed as symbolic gestures, often criticized for being too weak. But Canada turned that perception upside down. In his speech, Carney revealed that Canada had already sanctioned more than 3,000 individuals connected to Russia, including oligarchs and enablers of the Kremlin. He promised more were coming, and called on allies to match Canada's determination. Even more surprising, Canada publicly endorsed the idea of secondary sanctions, targeting not only Russia, but also countries that helped Russia evade restrictions. This was aggressive language, the kind usually reserved for Washington or Brussels, not Ottawa. The message was unmistakable. Canada wasn't afraid to play hardball. But where did this fire come from? The answer lies in Canada's unique connection to Ukraine. Unlike many other Western nations, Canada's relationship with Ukraine runs deep. Home to over 1.4 million people of Ukrainian descent, Canada has a bond that goes beyond politics. It's personal. This was highlighted when Diana, representing Canada at the UN, spoke as both a leader and a mother. She didn't just talk about geopolitics. She talked about the human pain, about imagining what it would be like if her own children were ripped away from her. She retold Ilya's story from the perspective of a grieving family, making it clear that this was not just a faraway war. It was a human tragedy that Canada felt in its heart. That emotional power resonated around the world. But what surprised many was what came next. Canada began to talk less like a victim of history and more like an architect of the future. For decades, Canada had been typecast as the helpful middle power, important but never decisive. That image is changing fast. At the UN, Carney invoked an old saying from the Cold War, "Trust but verify." It was a phrase once used by Ronald Reagan when dealing with the Soviet Union. But Carney flipped it on its head. With Putin, he said, the world could no longer trust but verify. Instead, the only way forward was to deter and fortify. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was doctrine. Canada was laying out a vision of international politics where it wasn't just tagging along with bigger powers, but shaping the direction of the fight. Suddenly, world leaders weren't just looking at Canada as a supporter, they were looking at Canada as a leader. But with great power comes great scrutiny. And Canada's bold new posture has sparked plenty of speculation. Some analysts claim Canada is filling a leadership vacuum, stepping up as the US grows more divided and distracted by internal politics. Others suggest Canada is trying to rebrand itself on the global stage, seizing an opportunity to gain influence. Critics, however, argue Canada is overreaching. They say it risks being dragged too deeply into conflicts that could stretch its resources. They warn that Canada might be punching above its weight. But supporters fire back. Isn't this exactly what the world needs? A nation that combines empathy with strength, values with action, and words with consequences. The debate continues, but one thing is clear. The world is paying attention to Canada in a way it hasn't in decades. So here we are. Canada, once thought of as the quiet neighbor to the north, is now emerging as a loud and forceful voice in global politics. From heartbreaking stories of abducted children to bold sanctions, from emotional speeches to new doctrines of deterrence, Canada has stepped into a role few expected it to play. But the big question remains, is this a temporary surge of leadership or the beginning of a permanent transformation? Has Canada truly arrived as a global power, or will old habits and powerful enemies drag it back into the background? One thing is certain, the world will never look at Canada the same way again. So, what do you think? Has Canada finally earned its place as a true global power, or is this just a momentary flash in history?